Myanmar's military regime is facing growing pressure both at home and abroad, 3 weeks after it seized power. The European Union has warned that it's considering sanctions, and the U.S. has penalized 2 more generals. Protests continue to swell in Myanmar despite the authorities' threat to use force against the crowds. At least 3 protesters have been killed, even though the regime insists that police are using minimal force. And let's bring in journalist Dave Grunbaum for more on this story. Hi, Dave. Good to see you. So the military warning that protesters could suffer loss of life if they continue to go out in the streets. That seems to only have encouraged protests more, hasn't it?
It brought out tremendous numbers of protesters yesterday. I mean, you saw the massive crowds. It was the biggest number of demonstrators we had seen so far. There are some estimates that across the country there may have been a total of 1 million people demonstrating, and I would not be surprised at all if that number was accurate. At the same time, though, a lot of these demonstrators, they take that threat very seriously. Some of the protesters yesterday and today, they've got on their arms their blood type and the contact information for their next of kin, because they know this is a military that in the past has gunned down protesters on the streets, 2007, 1988, and other times. So now the question is, where's the military's line this time where they would potentially use deadly force again?
Let's talk about the sanctions here, Dave. We know that the U.S. has penalized 2 more generals. The EU right now is considering sanctions as well. Is that going to force the military generals to change their attitude?
No, sanctions from the West, that's not going to get the generals to give up on the coup and just go back to the bunker. They knew these were going to eventually come when they went forward with the coup on February 1st. They made those calculations before February 1st. What the West needs to do is to get some Asian countries on board with pressure, to pressure the generals to reverse course. Asian countries that would have influence on the military generals, such as China and some Southeast Asian countries. But here's the thing. These countries, while they've said don't gun down protesters, release Aung San Suu Kyi, none of them have shown any stomach to say, hey, reverse the coup. That hasn't happened. And until that happens, international sanctions aren't going to have a huge impact on the generals' calculations.
What about targeting business interests? The European Union says it will not cancel special trade privileges that allow Myanmar tariff-free access to the EU's market. What do you make of that?
Well, this is an important thing because these trade preferences that Myanmar gets now, it allows industries such as textiles in Myanmar to get, tariff-free access to the EU's 450 million consumers. I mean, it creates tens of thousands of jobs. I've met some of the people who fill them, and a lot of them, they come from these remote villages in the countryside, and they come to the cities to work in these plants, and they send most of their pay back home to their families. It's a big deal. You take away that tariff-free access to the EU, and those jobs are gone. And this is a lesson learned from sanctions of the past, when the West had really harsh, widespread economic sanctions on Myanmar during its 50 years of military rule. And the people who paid the price during that were not the generals. They still found ways to make millions of dollars, but it was the common people who didn't have jobs and were living in poverty, in part because of that. So that's why now you see the West aiming for targeted sanctions at the generals and military-aligned businesses as opposed to widespread sanctions like they had in the past.
Journalist Dave Grunbaum, thank you for that analysis.
Sure thing.